The topic, of course, is Syria, and of course it's the contemporary situation in Syria as opposed to an in-depth historical overview. Having said that, those of you who have had me in class, you know I'm going to give you the in-depth historical overview to start, and then we'll do the contemporary situation. So let me go ahead and do that. First of all, Syria is an Arab state. So let me actually define what I mean by an Arab state. The Arabs began building an empire in 633 AD. Within 67 years, their empire stretched from Spain to Pakistan. It was, at that time, the largest empire on earth ever. There have been empires larger since, but that was, at that point, the largest ever, and it was made really, 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 really fast. The Arabs were not genocidal maniacs, so they weren't like the Spanish or the Mongols. When they conquered a place, they actually showed a shockingly large degree of tolerance, both to the religious practices in the place and then to the cultural differences in that place. So by 750, when the Abbasids take over, the Arab Empire at that point was majority Christian. The vast majority of the population did not speak Arabic. Muslims were the third largest, Islam was the third largest religion in the empire, right? It was this shockingly un-Arab and shockingly un-Muslim entity, political entity. It doesn't last for long. The Arab Empire unravels pretty fast. Within 200 years, chunks of it are breaking away. Within 400 years, it doesn't exist for all intents and purposes. It did exist on paper, but that was really it. It was done. It breaks up, and it breaks up into Persian chunks. The Turks carve off pieces. The Arabs are carving off pieces. North Africa is the first part to start to unravel, Spain and North Africa. And they break up into these little itty-bitty states ultimately. They're ruled by warlords. One of the problems that the Arabs had was that they weren't really, after they kind of established the empire, they just weren't as keen at sticking to warfare, and so they began doing this thing called the Mamluk. The Mamluk means owned, and what they were is they were slave warriors, and so their army was enslaved. And at one point the army went, has anybody noticed we're the only armed people here? Why are we slaves again? And they eventually rise up and they take over in Egypt and Syria. The empire continues to disintegrate. More and more pieces break off until the Ottomans basically come along and save the day. And they sort of reconstitute the empire. By that point, everything from Morocco to Iraq had transitioned from being mostly not Muslim and not Arab to becoming mostly Muslim and speaking Arabic. So that if you go to Morocco, ethnically, if you take the DNA of Moroccans, they're not Arab. There's probably some Arab blood there, but it's a small amount, 5% max. Same with Algeria, same with Egypt, same with Syria. Syria had a significant Arab population, but the majority of the population wasn't. They were Assyrian, they were Greek, they were Roman, they were Persian. And so what you ended up with was a huge swath of land that spoke Arabic, that had become majority Muslim, but ethnically it wasn't Arab. So culturally it had some similarities to the Arabs, but there were more cultural differences. So that when you say a person is Arab, or you say a state is Arab, or a country is Arab, like in the case of Syria, it's actually kind of a loose thing. Because culturally, there isn't that much in common between Syria and Algeria, frankly. And in fact, really the only thing that binds them together is the common language. But if you grabbed a Syrian and dropped him into Algeria and had him start speaking, there would be an immediate language problem because Algerian Arabic is significantly different from Syrian Arabic. So it's a little complicated and a little messy. Having said that, despite the Ottoman Empire's successes, the Ottoman Empire wasn't Arab. It was ruled by Turks, but the majority of the land that the Turks ruled was Arab. So it's, again, a little weird because you have this minority Turkish population ruling over this majority Arab population. The Ottoman Empire does very well militarily. It conquers out a huge chunk of land. To be fair, the Ottoman Empire is a made-up term. They didn't call themselves that. They called themselves the Sultanate of Rome. The stated goal of the Ottoman Empire was to recreate the Roman Empire, but it would be a Muslim Roman Empire. And they effectively did that. They conquered a swath of land that was roughly comparable to the Roman empires, but a little bit bigger, and it stretched out into other places that the Romans didn't stretch out into, and was missing the northwest chunk of the Roman Empire. The Ottoman Empire will eventually go into decline, however, because it doesn't keep up with Europe technologically. If you were to go back in time 500, 600 years, the Ottoman Empire was way ahead of Europe. But by about 200 years ago, the Ottoman Empire is starting to lag behind Europe. Europe has surpassed it in terms of technology and fighting ability. And the Ottoman Empire, by World War I, is in so much trouble, it's lost the vast majority of its territory. At the outbreak of World War I, what the Ottoman Empire had left was the western coast of what is now Saudi Arabia. It had the eastern coast of what is now Saudi Arabia, but not all of it. It had Iraq, what is now Palestine and Israel, what is now Syria and Lebanon, and what is now Turkey. At the end of World War II, they're going to lose all the Arabic-speaking chunks, plus about half of the Kurdish land that they owned. The Kurds are like Persians. They're in the same cultural linguistic group as the Persians. Persians are also not Arabs. So what ends up happening is the Europeans decide they're going to carve up the Ottoman Empire like a Thanksgiving Day turkey. In fact, they had decided to do this before World War I even broke out. They made a deal, and then they made a sort of secret deal with each other, France and Great Britain, called Sykes-Picot. And they were going to carve off a piece and give it to Greece, carve off a piece and give it to Italy. Another piece was going to go to Russia. They were going to take a piece for themselves, right? They had this really elaborate plan that required all the guys who fought in World War I against Germany and Austria and the Ottoman Empire and Bulgaria. It required them to all be on board. And in the end, one of them bails. And the one that bails is Russia, because it has the communist revolution and becomes the USSR eventually. Once that happens, Sykes-Picot kind of gets thrown for a loop, because part of the plan with Sykes-Picot was they were going to cut the Persian Empire in half. And they were the British were going to take the southern half of Persia, and the Russians were going to take the northern half of Persia. And the reason that was important was because Persian oil reserves were in the southwest corner, and Great Britain wanted Persian oil reserves. When Russia goes communist and says it's not going to participate in this, it takes Persia off the list of places that can be conquered, because the British can't conquer it by themselves. At that point, the British decide that they want Iraq. Iraq was supposed to go to France, but they know that there's oil in Iraq, especially in northern Iraq, so the British just simply take Iraq. The British are also going to take Palestine, and they're also going to take Jordan, because as far as the Brits are concerned, this is the Crusades coming to fruition, right? They're going to get Jerusalem, finally, right? Because in the Third Crusade, the one that King Richard the Lionhearted goes on, they don't retake Jerusalem. So this is the way England gets to kind of complete that story. They're finally going to get Jerusalem. What they end up giving the French is what is now Lebanon and Syria. And the Arabs aren't on board, because the Arabs have a different plan. The different plan was actually being created right there in World War I, and their plan was first to break away from the Ottoman Empire, but then to create a massive Arab kingdom, I shouldn't say massive, but a substantial Arab kingdom in what is now Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Syria, and Palestine. And the British and the French don't want that to happen, because they plan to carve that chunk of land up for themselves. And that's the whole Lawrence of Arabia story, right? He's racing the British and the French to Damascus. Well, really, the British, the French weren't racing. He's racing the British to Damascus, and the Arab army pulls it off. They capture Jerusalem first, they capture Damascus first. Their claim to establish their state is really strong. They think they've got this thing, and the British and the French begin sabotaging. They're intentionally setting fires in Damascus. They intentionally shut off the water and the electricity in Damascus. They're doing everything they can to make it so that the Arab Empire not the Arab Kingdom, I should say, can't succeed. And ultimately, the French will invade. They invade first Lebanon, and then in 1920 they cross the border into what is now Syria. The Arab population in Syria puts up a fight. They'll fight one battle, the Battle of Maysalun, and the Arabs are ultimately defeated in part because the French brought aircraft and tanks, and the Arabs they barely had artillery. They were actually doing cavalry charges on horseback into that, and that's just not going to end well. So Syria ends up in the French Empire. Iraq goes into a state of rebellion, same year, 1920, because it doesn't want to end up as part of the British Empire. And the British actually bombed Baghdad. They actually launched the world's first ever airplane aerial bombardment of a major city. And they bombed Baghdad, trying to force the Iraqis to submit. It's not the first aerial bombardment of a city. It's the first airplane aerial bombardment of a city. In World War I, the Germans were actually sending dirigibles over London, and they would have a guy in a basket take bombs, arm them, and throw them out the basket. So that was great, I'm sure. And by the way, it's not the first aerial bombing. It's the first aerial bombing by airplane of a city. The first aerial bombing was during the Mexican Revolution. In 1912, I believe, was the first time they used aircraft. It was actually in Mexico. Mexico did that first. How cool is that? In any case, Iraq eventually does submit. Since we're all adults here, I'm going to quote Prime Minister David Lloyd George. There was a public outcry against the idea of bombing Baghdad. Like, it was just offensive to so many people. Nobody could believe that the British were doing it. And David Lloyd George got up in front of Parliament and said, "Great Britain reserves the right to bomb niggers." So in case you didn't know, according to the British, Iraqis are Africans that can be slurred in this negative way. Can you imagine the racism today? Like if the president got up and said, "We have the right to bomb these people because they're..." Anyway. In any case, Iraq will submit, just as Syria did. In fact, the twisted irony is the king of Syria, the guy who's trying to create this kingdom, his name is Faisal. Faisal I. He was the king of the kingdom of Hijaz. If you watch the Lawrence of Arabia movie, he's Alec Guinness. So he's Obi-Wan Kenobi. When the British realize he's unemployed now because he's just lost Syria, they offer him to be the king of Iraq, and he becomes the king of Iraq. So he will become the puppet for the British as they try to rule Iraq. Having established this, there's something seriously wrong with Iraq and Syria. First of all, they're fake. They're made up. They don't exist. The word Syria has been around for thousands of years. That's not made up. But the word Iraq is so made up, we don't actually know where the British came up with it. There's some speculation that they came up with it from Uruk, which was one of the ancient Mesopotamian city-states. Could be. Another possibility is it's an ancient Arabic word for riverbank. That could be too. We don't know, because the British never wrote down how they came up with the name Iraq. They just made it up. Just boof, there it is. They're like Adam in the Garden of Eden, only this isn't the Garden of Eden. And the border that they create between these states, that's also arbitrarily drawn. If you'll notice in the top right on this map, there's sort of what color is that? It's beige? I don't know. That's Kurdish-ruled part of Iraq. But the Kurdish-ruled part of it goes across. Do you see where Kobane is? It's the big green circle, because we were bombing the hell out of the area around it. That's what the circles are, is our bombing campaign. That's also Kurdish. And then where it says Hasaka, to the right of that and up, that's also Kurdish. And what happened was the Kurds ended up getting divided. They got divided between Syria and Iraq, and there were Kurds living in Iran, and then Kurds living in Turkey. In other words, they just dropped the border. Who knows how they drew it? They were probably drunk. They had a crayon and the map of the area, and they're just like, hey, let's put it here. And they did this deliberately cutting the Kurds up because they wanted to deny the Kurds from ever having a state. That part they weren't drunk for. But for the rest of it, like, how did they get that really weird straight line that's the southeast border of Syria, right? And then Jordan, how did they even decide to make a Jordan? Like, what was that about? It's a tiny population, mostly desert. Like, what was the point in making it even? And the reality is that the Europeans weren't about trying to make good borders for the people that lived there. They were about dividing and conquering. They dropped borders into the Middle East that would effectively mess the Arabs up and prevent their long-term goal of unifying. Now, in the case of this part, the goal was to unify and create a single Arab kingdom in what is now the Asian part, what is the Asian part of the Arab world. Having said that, right around the same time period, 1919, riots break out in Cairo. They actually break out in Meydan Tahrir, which if you follow the Arab Spring you realize that was the center of the Arab Spring in Egypt in 2011, and then 2012 and 2013. And it was true in 1919 also. There's something about Meydan Tahrir. If you ever go to Egypt, you'll kind of see it. There's something magical about that spot. In 1919, the reason the Egyptians are rebelling is the same reason that the Irish are rebelling, and it's the same reason that Gandhi is in the act of rebellion. And what they're trying to do is they're trying to break the British Empire up. The Indians and the Irish and the Egyptians are communicating, they're talking to each other, they're trying to coordinate their protest activities. Ireland's trying to get independence, Egypt's trying to get independence, India's trying to get independence. India and Ireland were working so well together that they actually decided to make the same flag, right? You just take the Irish flag and tip it over, and you've got the Indian flag if you stick a wheel in the middle. That's not an accident, that was on purpose. Egypt wasn't that interested in sharing a common flag, but they were definitely sharing tactics. And in the 1919 riots in Cairo, Egypt, something amazing happened. So Egypt at the time was about 25% Christian. Its Christian minority has been shrinking as a portion of the country dramatically over the last 100 years. It's probably about 10% today. So it went from 25 to 10 in about 100 years. That 25% Christian population, they're called Copts. C-O-P-T, Copt. And then if there's a bunch of them, they're Copts. But it sounds like I'm saying Copts. I'm not, I'm saying Copts. Anyway, the Coptic population of Egypt decided to create a new ideology. And that ideology is called Pan-Arabism. And the goal of Pan-Arabism is to replace the joke states, because they're jokes, to replace UAE and Saudi Arabia and Egypt and Tunisia and Algeria and Morocco, all the joke states, Syria, Iraq, with one single political entity that would stretch from Morocco to Iraq. And they wanted to call it the United Arab Republic, and they wanted it to be secular, and they wanted it to be socialist. And that ideology is part of the reason Egypt is in a state of rebellion in 1919. The rebellion is so far blown, in fact, by 1920, the same year that the Irish are going to get independence, the Egyptians get virtual independence from the British Empire. They're not fully independent, but it's a step in the right direction as far as they're concerned. Everybody is excited about what happens in Egypt. India, of course, is still years out, because when India started to go violent, Gandhi backs off. He goes, no, we're not going to do this violently. We're going to do this non-violently. But the Irish and Egyptians were okay with the violence, so they get their independence, at least nominally, right? Ireland doesn't get full independence because the English are like, but we're going to keep this, and keeps Ulster, which is kind of a nasty thing to do. Go. Not all of you. It's like a divorce. I get to keep your arm. That's okay, right? I'm going to keep it in this little box over here. But you can leave me, just not with your arm. Anyway, so Syria is going to find itself in a really weird situation when World War II happens, because Germany takes out France really fast. Really, France is defeated in the first 2 weeks. It takes them about another 4 weeks to admit it because they're stubbornly holding on, but they were done fast, right? Heinz Guderian and Erwin Rommel put the French down in this amazing flanking maneuver that's just mind-boggling, and France is forced to surrender. And when France surrenders, the Germans make a strange deal with the French. The Germans are basically going to have the Atlantic coast of France. They're not annexing it. It doesn't become part of Germany. It's going to be a German occupation zone. And the reason is to prevent the English, and if later on the Americans get in a war, to prevent them from invading France. France then gets the Mediterranean interior, basically. And what they do is they take the town of Vichy, and they make that the new provisional capital. By the way, the new premier of France was the hero Pétain of World War I. He was the general who was the hero for World War I. And the Vichy French are on paper officially allies of Nazi Germany now. So France has effectively changed sides at that moment. Now it's on paper because the French aren't really on board. So even though France is willing to do stuff to sort of get by during the Nazi occupation, at the end of the day they're also doing a lot of foot dragging and sabotage. But what this means for the British is they've got a problem because their territory, so they've got Palestine and Jordan and Iraq, their territory to their northwest, Syria, is technically now a German ally. And so the British decide not to wait to figure out what the Vichy French are going to do, and they invade Syria. And it's actually a really bloody affair, but we don't think of it much, in part because it's not the cool stuff. The cool stuff, of course, isn't going to happen until after the United States gets in the war because we don't care about anybody else. So there's that. But then the other thing is that the British completely suppressed all the news coming out of Syria and didn't allow it to get to Britain because they didn't want the British to know that they were having this weird issue. And so what should have been probably an interesting World War II theater of operations is sort of lost to history a little bit. When the British take over Syria, they don't know what to do exactly, right? Because they got to keep the Syrian population happy because they don't want them to rebel, especially because right in the middle of all of this, Iraq goes into a state of rebellion. In May of 1940, Iraq decides they're done with the British Empire and they go into a state of rebellion. And so the British have to put that down. They've just put down Syria. And they're thinking, how do we make everybody happy? And one of the ways to do it would just be to liberalize a little bit. And so they do. And they actually will recognize Lebanon's independence from the French Empire. And they will basically tell the Syrian population, we're going to help you get your independence after World War II. Take it easy, be calm, everything's good. We're going to take care of the Germans, and then afterwards, we're going to hook you up. Everything's going to be okay. In 1946, Syria gets its independence from the French Empire. Syria has democratic elections. Everybody's kind of excited. Syria has historically always been a really well-developed part of the Arab world, culturally and economically. It's always done really well. Damascus is a wonderful city. It's a wealthy city. And in the midst of all of this, the CIA decides it's going to get involved in Syria. And in 1949, we assassinate the democratically elected president of Syria. And what follows is a decade, 2 decades. 1 decade. It's 49, 2 decades, 21 years. What follows is 21 years of unmitigated chaos. They have coup after coup, violent overthrow after violent overthrow. They never get their democracy back. That was it. They had democracy for 3 years, and then the United States went and zapped it, killed it in its infancy. In 1958, Syria is falling apart so fast that the Syrian government approaches the Egyptian government and says, annex us. We're done. And President of Egypt at the time, Gamal Abdel Nasser, who's a pan-Arabist, goes, what are you talking about? We can't just annex you. And the Syrian government says, we're done, we're finished, we're collapsing. We can't be stable. We've never been able to stabilize since 49. It's so bad, we're pretty sure the communists are going to take over. And Nasser, he was a socialist, but he hated the communists. He makes an alliance with the Soviet Union, but he hated the communists. And he goes, I don't want communists to take over in Syria. I don't want communists to take over anywhere. And they go, well, if you don't want communism in Syria, you have to annex us. And so Nasser jumps on an airplane, flies to Syria, and the president of Syria and the president of Egypt sign a treaty, and Egypt and Syria merge. It's called the United Arab Republic. And it doesn't last. It only lasts 3 years. At the height of its membership, it included Egypt, the Sudan, the Yemen, and Syria. Having said that, Sudan breaks away almost right away, and then in 1961, Syria declares its independence. And the reason was, in all fairness, because Nasser treated the Syrians really badly. He just was not good at ruling Syria. He wasn't fair with the Syrians. He constantly alienated them. He did not trust them. He probably shouldn't trust them because he had alienated them so badly that he shouldn't trust them, right? It was like this terrible feedback loop. And finally, in 61, Syria secedes from Egypt and says, but we're not done. If you guys straighten out your act and can treat us right, we're ready to join into a union with you again. On the Syrian end, it wasn't an angry secession. On the Egyptian end, it didn't feel very amicable. Having said that, in 1958, when Syria and Egypt merge, something else is also happening. Iraq. All right, so the Truman Doctrine, which you've probably encountered at some point in your education, is that the United States will fight communism no matter the cost. If we have to overthrow democracies, if we have to wage unjust wars, it's all good, as long as we're fighting communism. The Eisenhower Doctrine alters that. The Eisenhower Doctrine establishes that there's a priority before communism. And that priority is to destroy the French and British empires. Let that sink in for a moment. We want to destroy the empires of the two states that were our allies. We're in NATO already. NATO exists. It came into being in 1949. These are our two NATO allies. They're supposedly our two best friends. Right? Historically, for a long time, they've been friends. And our number one priority is to destroy their empires. Our number two priority is to prevent pan-Arabism from succeeding and to prevent the Arabs from unifying and creating a single state. Then after that, we're fighting communism. So in Iraq, the Soviets were dumping money into the communists. And so are we. Because we were worried that if the socialists won the revolution, we were worried primarily that the English would win and they'd keep Iraq inside the British Empire. We don't want that. That's our number one objective. So we got to send money to somebody. But if the socialists won, they would do the pan-Arabism thing and join Egypt and Syria. So we can't have that. So we began funding the communists because we knew they were going to try and bring Iraq into the Soviet sphere of influence, and that would prevent Iraq from then joining the United Arab Republic, right? So the irony of ironies, of course, is that we're undermining Great Britain by supporting the communists. The socialists win. They win the revolution. But the communists come in a close second. And so the socialists and the communists are stuck in Iraq making basically a compromise deal. But Iraq still has the ambition, the hope, the goal, because the socialists have won, of unifying with the United Arab Republic. By the way, they also want to take Kuwait back. Kuwait was carved out of the Basra province of the Ottoman Empire by Great Britain in 1900. When Great Britain makes Iraq, they take the Basra province, the Baghdad province, and the Mosul province, and they merge them. So the way the Iraqi population sees it is Kuwait is a breakaway piece of the Basra province, that it should simply be reattached to Iraq. So in 1958, Iraq wants to join the United Arab Republic. It also wants to annex Kuwait. So Eisenhower does what you should do in that situation, and he invades Lebanon. So it's the country to the left and slightly up from Damascus on that map. And the reason he invades Lebanon on paper, the excuse, is Lebanon was on the verge of a civil war, and he's trying to prevent it. It's a humanitarian mission. By the way, I should have brought it, I didn't think to. I found a really cool picture from the 1958 invasion. There are Marines marching and they've got a Confederate flag. So you didn't know this, but the CSA apparently was still around in 1958, at least in Lebanon. It's really funny because you can see the store behind it, like the name of the store is written in Arabic, and there's this Confederate flag. It's really weird. Anyway, we invade Lebanon in 1958. And the reason is we're sending a signal to Egypt, which is just merged with Syria, and to Iraq, that we're ready to inflict violence. That if you do something we don't like, we're already here. It's just hop, skip, and a jump, and we're there. And we told Iraq outright, if you invade Kuwait, we will drop a nuclear bomb on you. So that solved that. Iraq immediately dropped its claim to Kuwait. And then we did the last piece, which was we made sure that the communists ended up with just enough power in Iraq that they would prevent unification with Syria. A guy named Qasim is going to take over in Iraq. When Syria and Egypt break up in 1961, Qasim actually sends a communique going, we're ready, right? He was supposed to be the guy that prevented unification with Iraq and Syria and Egypt. But just as Syria and Egypt are breaking up, he goes, we're ready, Iraq's ready to join, but you guys are breaking up, that's awkward. And he says, well, if you ever change your mind and try to reunify, we want you to know we're gonna join you. It's why the Sudan, Yemen, Egypt, Syria, and Iraq all have the same flag. It's red, white, black, and then there's a variation. Like Egypt today has a golden eagle in the middle. Syria has 2 green stars. Iraq has 3 green stars with an Allahu Akbar on it. Iraq's 3 green stars is because it was Egypt, Syria, Iraq, right? Yemen has a triangle on the left-hand side. So does the Sudan. So there's a little bit of variation between them, but they have essentially the same basic scheme, which is red, white, black. And then in '63, the CIA kills Qasim. So don't worry, we cleaned that up. The guy that we helped get into power, we then execute so that we don't have to worry about a communist being in charge of Iraq, which of course then sends Iraq into a period of absolute mind-numbing coup d'etats that last about 10 years. And finally, we end up with a situation where Iraq will eventually be taken over by Saddam Hussein. Having said that, in 1970, Syria finally finds calm and peace. But before I do that, I need to back this thing up a little bit, because I want you to see what happens right before they find their calm and their peace. In 1948, the State of Israel, of course, is created. The State of Israel will get Palestine. When the UN is creating the State of Israel, they took Palestine and they actually cut it up into 7 pieces. 8 pieces. Sorry, they cut it up into 8 pieces. The area around what is now the Gaza Strip, but it was about twice as large as the Gaza Strip, that's going to become Arab. The West Bank, but it was a little bit bigger than that. It was probably about 1.25 times bigger than the West Bank. That was going to go Arab. And then in the northwest corner, that area was also going to go Arab. In the northeast corner, that was going to go Israeli. In the center, on the west, that was going to go Israeli. In the south, was going to go Israeli. The center west, though, was going to have a little enclave carved off of it for the city of Jaffa, and that was going to also go to the Palestinians. So the Palestinians were going to get that little enclave. And then Jerusalem in the center was going to be a neutral city that was essentially administered by the United Nations. That was the deal. Now here's the parameters. The Israeli part would be Jewish only. At that moment, it would mean that the Jewish-only state would be about 55% of Palestine. The Israelis owned about 5% of Palestine. So basically, 50% of Palestine that didn't belong to the Israelis would be simply handed over to them. And by own, I mean they had legal title to the land. They had purchased it. The Arab part, the Palestinian part, the remaining 45%, would be a secular state for Jews, Christians, and Muslims. So the reason why the Arabs don't like this, they don't think this is a good solution, is because the Arabs go, why is there a Jewish-only state? How does that make sense? Why are they getting a chunk of land for them only, but then the rest of us, the other part of us, is supposed to remain secular and democratic? And so the Arabs rebel, and they fight, and they lose. They get their asses handed to them. It's a humiliating defeat. And Israel comes into being. It takes about half of what should have been the Gaza Strip. It takes a sizable chunk of the West Bank, and the northwest corner, they take the whole thing. And Israel ends up with about 72% of Palestine instead of 55% by the time the dust settles. Israel is very quickly going to get on the same side as the United States in the and its relations to the Arabs, because it fears what would happen if there was a single Arab state from Iraq to Morocco, right? And the best hope that the Arabs have of having this happen is Gamal Abdel Nasser, the president of Egypt. Egypt has a revolution in 52. Again, it's centered around Medan Tahrir. And in the process, Nasser ends up taking over. He writes a new constitution for Egypt. And he secularizes Egypt. He's attempting to democratize it, to lay the foundation for a democracy in the future. Right? Obviously, you don't want to do that right now. And there was a study that was just done on African states. And the study was, should you do democracy right away, or should you let somebody rule for a really long time and then do democracy later after independence? And it turns out the African states that did democracy right away are all disaster basket cases. They're places like Somalia. And the African states that had a tyrant who basically ruled for a long period of time created stability, and now they're the most democratic and most stable states. So just in case you were wondering, democracy probably is rarely the solution to your problems. If voting in the United States is any indication, you should probably never do it, actually. It's probably a mistake. In any case, I've become a Platonist on the matter, in case you hadn't figured that out. Egypt is trying to develop its economy. It's trying to set itself up as the new Arab power. It's talking long term about how it's going to make the world a better place. Egypt is setting up an alliance with India. It's setting up an alliance with Yugoslavia. The thing that India, Egypt, and Yugoslavia have in common is they're neither US allies nor Soviet allies. They're trying to make it their own way. They don't want to be part of the Cold War. They reject the Cold War. They're talking about how they can help each other in terms of development, but also information sharing. It's a really complicated project. And the Israelis decide they have to foul it up any way they can. And so they get their opportunity in 1956. In 1956, Nasser nationalizes the Suez Canal. The Suez Canal was built with Egyptian labor by a French company. The French company then charged Egypt the cost of building the Suez Canal. That seems weird since they used Egyptian labor to do it. And then, of course, the British use that cost as an excuse to invade in 1882. In 1952, Egypt gets its real independence from Great Britain. On paper, they got it in 20, but they get it for real in 52 and after the revolution. When that happens, Egypt goes to the Brits and says, look, let's be friends. We can be on amicable terms. We would love to buy weapons from you. We need to militarize Egypt a little bit because we can't defend ourselves in the event somebody attacks us. The British go, never. We won't sell you anything. We're done with you. Now, the Egyptians had been buying from the US. The Egyptians had been buying surplus World War II equipment. It was mostly crap. They were getting these Stuarts where, you couldn't turn to the right, or the machine gun didn't work, or the main armament didn't work. We were giving them all our surplus crap. And Egypt's like, we can't use this stuff. This is not, you can't go to war with this stuff. We want real stuff. And they came to us. They came to the United States and said, what can you do? We would like to buy stuff from you. And Eisenhower administration said, oh, the Brits said they're not selling to you. We need to honor what the British say. We're not selling to you. So Egypt goes, well, let's look around. And they do. They look around, and they find somebody really excited to sell them stuff. It's Czechoslovakia. And the reason is a lot of German tanks in World War II were built in Czechoslovakia. And at the end of World War II, Czechoslovakia has all these German tanks they don't know what to do with. And they're like, hey, anybody want to buy these? And Egypt goes, we'd love to. The problem is Czechoslovakia is now in the Iron Curtain, right? Czechoslovakia is part of the Communist Pact, what will eventually become the Warsaw Pact. And so when Egypt purchases from Czechoslovakia, Great Britain cancels its funding of the Aswan High Dam. Great Britain had agreed to help Egypt build the Aswan High Dam. Egypt goes, oh, that's painful. And then Egypt goes to, Britain was going to pay for half. The United States was going to pay for the other half. Egypt then goes to the United States and goes, but you're still going to fund your half, right? And we go, no. Britain said no, we're out. So Egypt decides to nationalize the Suez Canal, and they'll take the revenue from ships passing through to build the Aswan High Dam. They nationalize the Suez Canal. The next thing you know, the British and the French are invading and the Israelis are invading. And their whole goal is to destabilize Nasser, to humiliate him so badly that he can't do anything. Actually, the Israelis went first. What the Israelis did was they invaded with the hope that the Egyptian army would then counter-invade and go into the Sinai, and then the British and the French would attack the Suez Canal and trap the Egyptian army in a pocket in the Sinai. And Nasser doesn't take the bait. He stays west of the Suez Canal and watches as the Israelis march across. And at that point, the French and the British do invade, but they're not trapping anybody because he never took the bait. You go, okay, so did they succeed? And here's the answer, no, because the United States turns on Great Britain and France. It's almost like Eisenhower set Great Britain and France up to do this. And then Eisenhower goes to the UN Security Council and goes, I want UN troops in the Sinai now. French and the British have to get out right now. And at that point, 1956, nobody said no to the United States. Right? We were the crazies who dropped a nuclear bomb twice. Like the whole world is like, yeah, whatever, here. And so there are actually UN troops going into Egypt with orders to shoot the French and the British if they're still there. And the British and the French are trying to get out of Bur Said, the port city that they had captured. They're trying to get out as fast as they could, and the Egyptian population knew it. So they filled the streets to block their escape so that they would get killed by the UN troops. But they still managed to get out. But I think that's kind of cool. That's what I would have wanted to do. No, you can't leave. You're going to get killed. But it didn't work out that way. In the end, in 56, what ends up happening is they're writing articles saying, was the 56 war Europe's Waterloo? Is this the end of European domination of the world? And that was exactly what the Eisenhower administration was hoping. The Eisenhower administration took Egypt's side to pull the carpet out from France and Great Britain. In effect, telling France and Great Britain two things. One, your empire is done. We're going to do everything we can to get rid of it. And two, don't you dare ever take military action without talking to us first. We own the park now. There's no playing on the jungle gym without our permission, right? And they get the message. They're good. Every once in a while, France goes and does something, but yeah, we're okay with that. The reason all of this matters then is because what 56 does is it sets Egypt up so that they really feel strong. They really feel like they have some influence. And everybody has really high expectations for Egypt now. Israel wants to knock Nasser down. And so Israel begins working systematically to figure out a way to do it. And what they come up with is this. They begin attacking the West Bank. After 48, when Israel's created, the West Bank becomes part of Jordan. My mom went to Jerusalem, I think in 64, and she actually brought back souvenirs that say, made in Jerusalem, Jordan. I still have one of them. I'm never going to give it up because it's so weird. Jerusalem, Jordan. It doesn't even sound right. It sounds really wrong. Anyway, the West Bank belonged to Jordan at that point. It's not that Jordan was administering it. The Gaza Strip was administered by Egypt, but Egypt never annexed it. In the case of the West Bank, Jordan annexed it. Jerusalem was a city in Jordan, not in a territory occupied by Jordan. And what happened was the Israelis began raiding Palestinian refugee camps in Jordan, in the West Bank. And then King Hussein of Jordan would go and he'd say, Egypt, help us. We can't stop the Israelis, but you can. But Egypt didn't want to do this, didn't want to have anything to do with this, because Egypt was involved in the Yemeni Civil War. Yemen was in the midst of a mind-numbing war. It was a disaster. And Egypt had been invited by the Yemenis to go there, so they went. So they're in the midst of this mind-numbing war. They've got most of their army committed. They've got a huge chunk of their Air Force committed. It's their Vietnam. They didn't know who the enemies were because nobody was wearing uniforms. They would go village to village trying to secure Yemen. People would just jump out of nowhere with grenades tied to their chest and blow themselves up. It was an insane disaster. And the Egyptians were not equipped and not ready to fight that style of a guerrilla war. But they're there for 7 years, by the way. So they ended up really stuck. It was a long, drawn-out nightmare for everybody. And by the way, just for the record, Great Britain, the United States, and Israel and Saudi Arabia were helping the monarchists fight the Egyptians and the socialists who were trying to establish a democracy. So, in case you were wondering where we were in that. In any case, isn't that neat? United States, Saudi Arabia, Israel, and Great Britain on the same side. That doesn't happen very often, except that it happens all the time, it turns out. But we pretend. We're good at pretending. That's what we're really good at. What ends up happening is there's a strip at the bottom of the Gulf of Aqaba. So, the Sinai comes down like this, and there's a stretch of water, a really thin stretch of water called the Gulf of Aqaba. And at the point, at the tip of the Gulf of Aqaba, is where Saudi Arabia and Egypt come the closest to touching. And at that point, it's called the Straits of Tiran. And Nasser decides to close the Straits of Tiran as a symbolic gesture to punish Israel for attacking Jordan. The irony, of course, is Egypt does nothing to actually close the Straits of Tiran. They just simply say, we're going to close the Straits of Tiran. The reason that's important is because then Israel goes, the lifeblood of Israel is being choked by an economic attack by cutting off our supplies that were coming through the Straits of Tiran. By the way, it was less than 1% of all Israeli imports. And Egypt didn't actually block those Israeli imports. They just symbolically said, please stop using the Straits of Tiran. Israel then uses that as their excuse to launch the Six-Day War in 1967. Egypt was so caught off guard that all 222 Egyptian aircraft were destroyed on the runways. Not a single plane got in the air. The whole conflict took 6 days. Israel attacked Jordan, Egypt, and Syria simultaneously and brought all three states to a humiliating conclusion. They had to surrender really quickly. And Israel captures the Golan Heights, the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, and the Sinai. And it's actually the foundation for the problem that we have today, because Israel still has the West Bank, the Golan Heights, and the Gaza Strip. Anyway, having said that, Syria gets really, really badly, humiliatingly defeated in the process. But in 1970, Syria gets a turnaround event. By the way, Egypt gets a turnaround event, but going the wrong direction. Egypt was on an interesting path. It was on a good path. In 70, Sadat becomes president, Nasser dies, and Egypt is going to now go the exact wrong direction. Syria, on the other hand, is finally going to get stability. And they get it because of a guy named Hafez al-Assad. He becomes the tyrant who takes over in Syria. As nasty as he is, he brings stability to Syria, and he stops the constant coups. And he will rule until his death, about 15 years ago. So he ends up ruling for about 30 years, 3 decades. His son takes over. His son is exciting. Everybody thinks things are going to be better with Bashar al-Assad. And the reason they think that Bashar al-Assad is going to be better is because he's an MD, right? How bad can it be if you're an MD? You're going to be a better person just because you're smarter, obviously you care about people. And very soon it becomes clear that Bashar al-Assad is going to rule Syria the same way his dad did with an iron fist. Having said that, Syria is prosperous, it's stable, it had up until that point about 3 decades worth of stability. Bashar al-Assad will give it a 4th decade, and then the Arab Spring breaks out in 2011. But before we do that, we really need to back this thing up to the US relationship with Iraq. Today happens to be the 35th anniversary of the start of the Iran-Iraq War. I didn't plan for that, it just happened that I was giving this lecture on this day. What happened was, Iran had a revolution, the Islamic Revolution. In 1979, the Shah of Iran had been overthrown, and Iran declared itself to be the Islamic Republic of Iran. Up until that point, Iran had been ruled by a tyrant, the Shah, who wasn't put into power by the United States, but we made him more powerful than he should have been. And what had happened was this. Iran had a democratic election in 1950. It was their second attempt at democracy. In 1953, the United States actually went in with the CIA. Kermit Roosevelt was the guy in charge, the grandson of Theodore. And Kermit Roosevelt and the CIA overthrew Mossadegh, the democratically elected president of Iran. What Iran ends up with then in the aftermath of it is a quarter century of tyranny. Their democracy's gone, and they get stuck in a situation where anybody the Shah doesn't like, he imprisons. They have a revolution basically to get rid of the Shah and to maybe get democracy, and they go the other direction from the direction they were going in. They were heading towards liberalization. Now they swing the other direction, and they create an Islamic state. But Iran was our best friend, maybe in the world, like maybe even more than Britain. Like we keep backstabbing Britain. They had reasons to not like us. People call Iran Little America. They also called it the shopping mall of the Middle East. The rate of bleach consumption in Iran was through the roof because all Iranian women wanted to have blonde hair so they could feel American. And also, by the way, nose jobs. All Iranian women had nose jobs. They still do, by the way. They haven't given that up. I've been to Tehran, and you walk down the street, and everybody's got a bandage on their nose. It's like, is there a lot of violence towards women? Oh, no. They just want to have a European-style nose. They hate their Iranian nose. And that's a big thing to hate, I got to tell you. So here's this little America, the shopping mall of the Middle East. The United States actually liked Iran so much, we gave them, I don't know why, we gave them the plates for printing our money. They actually had a copy. So after the revolution, they gave that to Hezbollah. That's how Hezbollah funded itself in the beginning. They just print $20 bills. They were perfect because they were our plates. Like they didn't have any flaws. And the only thing that was wrong was the ink wasn't right and the paper wasn't right. But other than that, that was it. Also F-14s. 3 places on Earth had the F-14. The United States, Great Britain, and Iran. Like Iran was just, we thought, the world of them. We even put our headquarters for the CIA in Iran, for Asia, all Asia operations. Right? Iran was it. They have the revolution. We're heartbroken. We can't believe that they're rejecting us. And we decide we're going to punish Iran for rejecting us. And the way we're going to punish Iran is a proxy war. And Iraq was our guy. We convinced Iraq, using faulty US intelligence, that Iran could not sustain an Iraqi attack, and Saddam Hussein invaded. And we funded, we assisted, we equipped, we supplied the Iraqis. We also supplied the Iranians, but at 4 times market value. We did the Iraqis at market value. We also asked the whole world to stop selling weapons to both sides, and then that allowed our share to increase. Right? Isn't that genius? Let's stop the war by helping them run out of weapons. Your weapons. We're going to keep selling them weapons because we're the United States. And we make up our own rules as we go, and that's okay. Because what are you going to do? We'll just nuke you. So, that's sort of US foreign policy in a nutshell. And we're going to pretend the whole time that we're making the world a better place until people finally figure out that we're not. The Iran-Iraq war lasts just over 8 years. 1 million people die. Nothing changes. The border between Iraq and Iran is essentially exactly identical to where it was before. Nothing is gained. Henry Kissinger famously said, "It's a shame both sides can't lose," but that's exactly what happened. Neither side won. Both sides did lose. Nothing was gained from the whole thing. In the aftermath of the Iran-Iraq war, Iraq wants to increase its share of OPEC sales and goes to OPEC and says, hey, can you let us and Iran, our former enemy, increase our share of OPEC sales so that we can make a little bit more money to get out of the debt we're in. And OPEC agrees, and then Kuwait, an OPEC member, immediately begins flooding the market with oil that they had been stealing from Iraq. Kuwait had been stealing Iraqi oil and then using it to flood the market to crash the price of oil so Iraq couldn't get back on its feet. Iraq asks the UN to intervene. The UN goes, investigates, fines for Iraq. Iraq then meets with April Glasby, the US ambassador to Iraq, and Saddam Hussein says, we're going to have to do something about Kuwait. She says, what happens between Arab states is of no concern to the United States. In other words, ding, green light, because Kuwait's Arab. Next thing you know, Kuwait's invaded by Iraq. The whole conflict took 24 hours, mostly because it took that long for the Kuwaiti military to run away as fast as they could. Almost nobody dies in the 24 hours. There's no looting, there's no pillaging, there's no plundering. It's a very nice, clean, annexation of Kuwait. Iraq feels like it's finally got its breakaway territory back. George Bush Sr. gets up in front of the world and says, at this point, I don't see anything wrong with this. However, I'm going to look into it further. Next thing you know, he and Margaret Thatcher meet in Aspen. They come out of the meeting, and Bush is like, he's a Hitler. He's a Hitler. We have to stop him. It's 180 degrees from go to he's a Hitler. Like, where did it come from? Nobody's really clear. Next thing you know, we do the first war against Iraq. About 185,000 Iraqis die. And then we impose the most brutal sanctions in human history on Iraq. We cut off their food, and we cut off their medicine for 12 years. 100,000 Iraqis die per year. By the end of the Clinton administration, the first 8 years of these brutal sanctions, 800,000 people were dead. The UN estimated that of the 800,000 Iraqis that had starved to death or died because of lack of medicine, 500,000, 500,000, were age 5 and under. We murdered 500,000 babies in that 8-year span of time. Over the next 4 years, we kill another 100,000 a year until there's Iraq War II in 2003. And at that point, from that point on, from 2003 until we withdraw, we killed another 1.3 to 2 million Iraqis. In other words, over the course of the last 20, or the course of that 21 years, basically from 1991 to 2011, we killed about 3 million Iraqis. Beginning in 2004, al-Qaeda in Iraq forms. Now, there was an al-Qaeda camp in Iraq, but it was in the Kurdish part of Iraq, and it was CIA funded, even after 9/11. So those were our guys, effectively. By the way, al-Qaeda was ours in Afghanistan, of course. So just for the record. Al-Qaeda in Iraq, that organization, which is formed in 2004, had nothing to do with the existing camp in Kurdistan. In fact, they had been enemies. The guys that formed al-Qaeda in 2004 in Iraq were enemies of the original organization, so much so that Osama bin Laden had a hit put on Saddam Hussein. The guys who formed al-Qaeda in Iraq in 2004 are ex-members of Saddam Hussein's military and his police and his government. Now, the reason why they're doing this is because in 2003, when we invade, we dissolve the Iraqi state. We eliminate it. We take an existing stable state, we get rid of its police, we get rid of its military, we get rid of its bureaucracy, we start over. We're setting Iraq back to zero, like as if we were gods and we could build a brand new thing. Those guys hate us. They hate our guts because we just unemployed them. They hate our guts because we've been slaughtering them. They hate us for every reason you could ever. If somebody did this to Texas, you would be hating them too, and there'd be an al-Qaeda in Texas, and you would be volunteering for it. And they give us hell. For 2 years, we don't know what to do. They're blowing stuff up, guerrilla attacks, terrorist attacks, IEDs, you name it. It's miserable. And then we get a brilliant idea. It's General Petraeus' idea. And the idea is twofold. One, we're going to have a surge, and we're going to pretend that's what solves the problem. It's not, but it's a good way to pretend. It's a good thing to pretend. The way we're going to actually solve this is we're going to ship pallets of money, mostly $20 bills. And we're actually going to have forklifts drive around the country and deliver these pallets of money to the warlords. So what ends up happening is we deliver these pallets of money right to the Iraqi warlords, and we tell them, hey, why don't you go after al-Qaeda? If you wipe these guys out for us, the money is yours. And they jump on this. Not only are they going to have a bunch of money to buy themselves weapons with and buy themselves influence with, and maybe even develop, right? Because it wouldn't hurt them any if they kind of fixed up the area that they're ruling over. It would definitely make the locals like them more. Not only are they happy about that, they're also starting to think long term. By 2006, 2007, these guys know our time in Iraq is limited. They figure we're probably there for another 2, 3, 4, maybe 5 years. They want to have it kind of in place who's going to be the new rulers of Iraq on the other side of our withdrawal. And one of the things they decided they don't want is al-Qaeda there. So they can't wait to kill al-Qaeda. And over the next 2 years, they tear al-Qaeda in Iraq to pieces. It's brutal. It's very successful. This is the so-called Sunni awakening. Turns out you can awaken people with pallets of money. Who would have thought? Al-Qaeda in Iraq is so smashed up, in fact, they have to withdraw. They actually flee the country. They flee to Syria. They flee to Syria, and Bashar al-Assad is happy to have them there because he figures an enemy of an enemy is a friend. He doesn't like them. He actually really hates them. But he's hoping that at some point they're going to go back into Iraq and cause chaos again for Iraq. Or at least for the United States. And then we withdraw. And just as we're doing that, the Arab Spring starts. It starts in Tunisia in December of 2010 when a man named Bouazizi, a vegetable vendor, is approached by cops. And the cops harass him and they want a bribe. And he didn't have his paperwork in order to be a vegetable vendor. And so they're basically like, give us a bribe or we're going to mess your stuff up. And he doesn't have the money, so they mess his stuff up. And then he stands up for himself and he gets slapped by one of the police. So he goes to the nearby police station and he puts in a formal complaint. And of course the police are like, screw you. Who are you? You're going to complain against us? And so he goes into the middle of his town, the middle of the square in the middle of his town, and he pours a can of gasoline on his head, and he lights himself on fire. And people go nuts. One guy lit himself on fire, and we've basically now had 4 years of revolution, not just in the Arab world. The thing people don't realize about the Arab Spring is it's global. There have been revolts in India, in China, in Chile, in Brazil, in the United States. What do you think the Occupy movement was? That was the Arab Spring manifest in the United States. The Arab Spring wasn't Arab, and it didn't just be confined to the spring, and it didn't necessarily mean you were going to end up better off than how you started. Although Tunisia has. Tunisia is like the one state that maybe has turned out okay. Myanmar had a lot of hope. Right? Burma got into this because they were like, oh crap, that could happen here. Let's do some reforms. But it turns out that maybe at the end of the day, Burmese reforms weren't as great as we had thought. There was a lot of hope for Libya. Libya is a disaster basket case. The government now controls the 10th largest city. That's it. They just have the 10th largest city. They don't have 1 through 9 or anything else for that matter. They don't have 11, 12, 13. They just have the 10th largest city. It's a disaster. The Arab Spring, of course, at some level, repudiates the US intervention in Iraq because had the United States not invaded in Iraq, it might have had the Arab Spring there. And one of the reasons we believe that's probably true is because as it was, the Iraqi government had to deal with the Arab Spring. There were in fact, rolling protests across Iraq during the Arab Spring. They didn't ever get the kind of traction that they got in places like Egypt or in Tunisia, in part because the Iraqis were so brutally exhausted after losing 3 million people. And in part because their infrastructure was shattered, their civil society was crushed, and they were trying to start over. In Syria, the Arab Spring goes terribly wrong, in part because of the response by Bashar al-Assad. So Tunisia is the first place to get the Arab Spring. The second place to get the Arab Spring was actually Algeria. President Bouteflika of Algeria didn't tolerate it. He crushed it. He was just brutal. If he even suspected you were thinking of Arab Springing him, you were in jail or dead. Like he did not waste any time. So Tunisia, the government collapses really fast, 30 days. Ben Ali's out. In Algeria, Bouteflika just crushes the Arab Spring and it's finished. Bashar al-Assad in Syria, when the Arab Spring breaks out in Syria, thinks, I'll do the same thing. And he actually starts by brutalizing children who were spraying graffiti on a wall. And the Syrian population can't believe that he's going to go after kids. And they begin to give up the idea of protesting to end this situation. And they go into a state of armed conflict. The weapons that they're getting are in part coming from Iraq, right? Because Iraq was destroyed. It's a failed state. There's no way you can look at Iraq and go, that was a success story. Iraq's a failed state, so it's an open wound, and it's easy to get weapons through it into Syria. But having said that, countries that had been really interested in seeing Bashar al-Assad go are also now pumping weapons into Syria deliberately. This allows for various militias to pop up all over Syria. Pretty soon, there ends up being 4 major actors in the Syrian Civil War. There's the government, Bashar al-Assad's government. There's Jabhat al-Nusra, which is al-Qaeda in Syria. There's the Free Syrian Army, which was the guys that we were interested in helping and that the Europeans have been helping to a degree, and that the Turks have been helping to a degree, and the Saudis also. And then there was number 4, al-Qaeda in Iraq. And al-Qaeda in Iraq goes, chaos, civil war. This is exactly what we're good at. And they jump in, but they need a name change because they're not in Iraq anymore, right? This isn't Kansas. And so they switch their name to Islamic State in Iraq and the Levant, which would be ISIL. Stop saying ISIS. ISIS was an Egyptian goddess. It's ISIL. If you know that the Arabic word for Levant is Sham, that's cool. It's Dawlat al-Islamiyya fi Iraq wal Sham, but then that's Daesh. So you still can't say ISIS. There's no way to say ISIS. It's just irritating. Once Daesh or ISIL goes into effect and joins this, they get really big. Oh, there's a 5th actor, sorry, the Kurds. And the Kurds are, of course, in the far north towards Kobane and then in the northwest corner. ISIL is, see where it says Raqqa, R-A-Q-Q-A? That becomes the center of their uprising. And pretty soon, they're capturing the Euphrates River in Syria. That becomes their place of operation. Now notice that I said there's Jabhat al-Nusra, which is the al-Qaeda in Syria. The reason why there's 2 al-Qaeda forces in Syria is by this point, al-Qaeda in Iraq, which is now in Syria, was kicked out of al-Qaeda. And the reason they were kicked out was al-Qaeda had decided they were just too brutal. They were too inhumane. They were too nasty. They were so far gone that al-Qaeda was like, you can't be a member. You're making us look bad. ISIL is going to start getting some really crazy victories really early on. The Free Syrian Army is going to go nowhere really fast. They got Aleppo for a while, and they lose that pretty early on. They lose part of it. They still have a piece, but they've lost a huge chunk of it. The Syrian government systematically, slowly keeps losing more and more territory. They're down to about 25% of Syria. You can see on the map that the area that ISIL controls in Syria is really quite diverse. They're all over the place. They've got the Euphrates River completely cinched up. They're on the edge with Aleppo. They're on the edge with the Kurds in the north. They're really close to Damascus in the south. They've actually pushed right up against Lebanon. They've done very well for themselves. They are extremist in the extreme sense. So there's been an attempt by the US government to make the distinction between a fundamentalist, an Islamist, and a jihadist. And now ISIL is sort of being cast as the jihadists. That they're guys who want to do holy war, they're completely crazy, they're over the top, they're extremely violent, they're ready to cut your head off at the drop of a hat. On the other end, or next to that, are the Islamists. What the Islamists want to do is they want to create an Islamic state. They don't need to do holy war against the whole world. They're not necessarily eager to behead anybody. They might, but they're not going to go out of their way to do this. Their level of violence is shockingly less. So that's the difference between Al-Qaeda and ISIL. ISIL is the full-throttle, testosterone, steroidal crazy that the United States used to portray Al-Qaeda as, but now realizes that Al-Qaeda is the toned-down version. If you'll recall, last year there was a series of beheadings going on in Syria. Don't YouTube these. You can, just don't. You will lose parts of your soul. They're absolutely brutal. I made the mistake of YouTubing a mass execution. Just really, there's no reason to do this. You gain nothing from it. Just, you've heard that horrible things are happening. You don't have to go there. Having said that, one of the things that ISIL has had is a group of Americans that they had as captives. Jabhat al-Nusra, Al-Qaeda in Syria, Al-Qaeda in Syria, actually went to ISIL and said, please, don't execute these people. Give them to us. And ISIL's like, why would we give them to you? And Jabhat al-Nusra goes, we'll pay you for them. We will buy them from you. Whatever you want, please don't execute these people. And ISIL's like, we're going to execute them. We're going to kill them. And they negotiated back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. And finally, I don't know how Jabhat al-Nusra did it. I don't know what they did. But they actually managed to get an American turned over to them. They took the American, and they went to where the Syrian army, where their front line was with the Syrian army, and they put up a white flag. And they had the American walk out into the no man's land between the two forces, and the Syrian army picked the guy up. They had a little note attached to him saying, please get this guy to the United States. The Syrian army then went to the Golan Heights and went up to the demilitarized zone and made him walk into the Israeli-occupied part of Syria, and he then walked over to the Israelis and got back to the United States. ISIL is such a level of insane that Al-Qaeda is trying to save American lives.
You're saying Al-Qaeda, right?
Sure, but I'm not saying it the way you say it. Al-Qaeda means the general. That's what they call themselves. And anyway. Taliban, the students. I don't think the names are particularly clever, but anyway, what can you do? In 2014, I don't want to keep focusing on the brutality, although I'm going to give you some more examples, just because I think it's good to get grounded in them. In 2014, something really amazing happened. 700 or so ISIL combatants got into pickup trucks and cars, and they're poorly armed, assault rifles, that's about it. Nothing fancy, no RPGs, right? Just no grenade launchers, just a few assault rifles. And they drove across the border back into Iraq. Like they went home. And those 700 men were facing 30,000 Iraqi soldiers. US trained, US equipped Iraqi soldiers. 30,000 versus 700. And within 2 weeks, the 30,000 men had fled and were running as fast as they could, mostly on foot, towards Baghdad. They just ran. They dropped their equipment and ran. Their equipment included tanks, armored personnel carriers, it included RPGs, grenade launchers, you name it, helicopters, and even some aircraft. And so ISIL went from having almost nothing in terms of heavy equipment to actually being really well off. Now, they've lost most of their aerial assets already, and they've already lost most of their tanks. But it was really weird. For a moment there, they actually had tanks. They actually had armored personnel carriers. All US stuff, right? Because that's what we gave the Iraqis. So there's been this sort of moment of, what's wrong with the Iraqis? And here Here's what's wrong with the Iraqis. Their state apparatus was destroyed. States don't get rebirthed overnight. It takes years to develop state culture. It takes years to develop loyalty to a state apparatus. It takes years to get institutions to really sink in. Militaries can't be born overnight. If you look at the United States military's performance in World War II, the Marine Corps did very well. The Army kind of stunk. The Army performance in World War II, when you planned for a battle with the US Army, you had to know your soldiers would advance, and then they would run back. And then they would advance, and then they would run back. And then they would advance. You just had to plan that in because they didn't have good culture. They didn't have good combat culture. Why? Because the Army went from like 100,000 to 7 million instantaneously. There was no way to carry any culture over when you do something like that. On the other hand, the Marine Corps was very picky about who they let in, and it grew slowly, so as a result, it passed on its culture to the new recruits, as opposed to losing its culture in the process. This is just the nature of human beings. Culture is slowly acquired. You can't tear something down like a state and expect it to pop back up. I mean, think about it. In 1958, Iraq has a revolution to get rid of the king. It's not for another 15 years before they have their first stable government. It took them 15 years to stabilize, which would mean 2026, right? If that was their timeline again. So expecting them in 2013, just 2-3 years after the US withdrew, expecting them to actually be able to resist anything, or 2014, is unrealistic. It doesn't even make sense. This isn't even in the ballpark. That and ISIL was really scary, right? They had already been putting on YouTube these mass executions. They would just dig a hole, they'd push people into it, and they'd just shoot them with an assault rifle, and then they'd go individual to individual and either shoot them again or decapitate them to make sure everybody was dead. ISIL advanced so quickly last year in the summer that they actually got to just outside of Baghdad. In fact, you can see Baghdad gets a small circle because we haven't bombed it too much since we started our bombing campaign. You can see that there is ISIL operation zones all around it. The hash area is ISIL operation zones, right? Baghdad actually, in the summer of 2014, was completely surrounded by ISIL. ISIL was actually encroaching on the suburbs of Baghdad. They could see Baghdad. They were in line of sight of it. They were there. And it looked like the city might fall. Like it was really iffy there for a while. And what happened was, I was listening to BBC and they had this guy on. His unit, which was on the western edge of Baghdad, had just been attacked and was being overrun. And most of his comrades were dead. They had been fighting really hard. And at this point, he needed to run away, but there was no route path for him. So he was kind of stuck. So he decided to do was lay down with the dead and pretend he's dead. And ISIL doesn't leave anybody. They go and they decapitate everybody. And so they're actually going through and cutting off the heads of all his comrades. And he knows they're getting closer and they're getting closer to him. And he's like, oh, how am I going to get out of this? What happens? His cell phone goes off. He's like, oh, that's it. I'm so dead. And the guy reaches into his pocket, pulls out his cell phone, and answers it and says, I just killed your brother, and hangs up on whoever it was calling. And then, at that moment, shooting breaks out in another area, and the guy and his comrades who are decapitating everybody leave. And that guy stands up as soon as they leave, and he yells, is anybody else alive? And one other guy jumps up, and the two of them go running to Baghdad. That's how that guy made it. These are the types of stories that we were getting out of Iraq a year ago. It's just unbelievable chaos. Everybody's terrorized out of their mind. Everything is in collapse and ruin. And so see where it says Mosul Dam area? Just south of that is the city of Mosul. It keeps varying on the US press whether Mosul is the second largest city in Iraq or the third largest city in Iraq. I've noticed that when something exciting is happening in Basra, that's suddenly the second largest city. And when something's happening exciting in Mosul, that's suddenly the second largest city. I'm pretty sure, though I didn't think to look it up to confirm this before the lecture, I'm pretty sure Basra is the second largest city in Iraq and that Mosul is the third. But in any case, it's something like that. So Iraq lost its second or third largest city when they lost Mosul, including the dam on the Tigris River, which is no small thing. This is a primary source for Iraqi electricity generation, and it's also a major part of Iraq's agriculture system because they can use it to irrigate higher land from the dam. So losing the dam was a problem. Also, see where Erbil is? That's the capital of the Kurdish autonomous region. Kurdistan's a state for all intents and purposes. Kurdistan broke off of Iraq in the aftermath of the 2003 war in every way except actually declaring its independence. It not only has its own independent military and its own flag, they have tanks, right? They are completely separate from the Iraqi military. It's not like they're an autonomous region that still works with Iraq. They are, for all intents and purposes, gone. The ISIL was actually on the verge of capturing Erbil, which was freaking everyone out because the Kurdish military is the best military force in Iraq. It's better than the Shia militias, it's better than the Iraqi military, and the Kurds have a lot of experience because they've been fighting for a really long time. Especially the PKK, they're like the best. The Peshmerga is amazing, but the PKK, they're really good. Like when US soldiers become mercenaries and want to fight for the Kurds, they join the PKK over the Peshmerga because they're just really good at this. And by the way, the Peshmerga and the PKK work together on a regular basis. They're not hostile towards each other. And they're getting crushed. Erbil is a rich city. It's a well-developed city. The idea of it collapsing really became too scary, too horrible for anybody to fathom. And that's when the US began bombing. That's when the big green circle started to form. We decided we had to prevent Erbil from falling, which is why it has that circle over it. That was our attempt to crush the Islamic State as it advanced on Erbil. At that point, Saudi Arabia jumps in, Jordan jumps in, the UAE, Qatar, they all jump in, they begin helping us bomb. Also, Iran steps in. Iran actually was sending soldiers into Iraq. They had actually been sending soldiers in ever since ISIL invaded. But as Erbil is, as the threat of Erbil falling is starting to get really scary, Iran really puts in a lot of soldiers. Their goal, of course, was to fight ISIL in every way, shape, and form. So at that moment, we had a really weird situation because in Syria, the Syrian government and Hezbollah were actively fighting ISIL. In Iraq, Iran, the remnants of the Iraqi state, which by the way is pro-Iranian, in case you didn't know that. Anyway, so we went, did this war, got rid of an ally, Saddam Hussein was our ally, and replaced him with a pro-Iranian government. Is that what victory looks like? I'm confused. I'm actually surprised you're here. Did you have something to do that would make you cheery and happy?
Well, I lived this.
Yeah, you did. So we're actually in this really weird situation where we're bombing the enemy of Syria and Hezbollah and Iran, and the Saudis are helping us do this. And then to make things even more complicated and even weirder, Israel starts bombing Hezbollah positions in Syria. So Hezbollah is fighting ISIL, we're bombing ISIL, and then Israel's bombing Hezbollah. So our ally is bombing the guys helping us against our enemy, but we're not done yet. This year, Turkey jumps into the fray. Now, Turkey had been letting us fly over their airspace, but they weren't letting us use their air bases for military operations until a couple of months ago. Now Turkey allows us to use their air bases for military operations. Having said that, the deal that they struck with us is they get to also conduct their own military operations in Iraq. They are bombing ISIL, but that's low priority. Their number one target is bombing the Kurds. So we're helping the Kurds while our ally Turkey bombs the Kurds, while helping us bomb ISIL and bombing ISIL, while Israel bombs Hezbollah, which is also fighting ISIL, in a war that we're on the same side with our enemy Iran and our enemy Syria, and like, then to make things better, there's the bloody civil war in Yemen. In Yemen, the Iranians are helping the Houthi rebels, who are Shia, overrun the government in Yemen, which, by the way, was nearly destroyed during the Arab Spring, but barely eked out survival. The president in Yemen actually at one point had an RPG blow up in his face, and it shredded his face. I don't know how the bastard survived. They got him on an airplane because they didn't have a hospital that could take care of him, flew him to Saudi Arabia, put his face back together as best they could, waited for him to recover, and flew him back to Yemen. He's like, I'm still president. It's like, dude, don't you know when to quit? Anyway, he finally had to resign because it was just so bad. But by him resigning, the government survived, and then the next year, there's this bloody civil war against the Houthis. And now the Saudis are bombing the Houthis that the Iranians are helping. So Saudi Arabia and Iran are allies in Iraq, but they're enemies in Yemen. And of course, we're on Saudi Arabia's side in Yemen also. So the whole thing's a total mess. It's very confusing. And then, of course, there's the Iran nuclear deal. Now, a key ingredient of the Iran nuclear deal is this. I'm glad you're seated, well, at least most of you are. A key part of this was we couldn't stand that the theater of operations commander against ISIL in Iraq was an Iranian. It was driving us nuts. And so what we insisted was that the US would be the theater of operations command and that the Iranians would be subordinate in return for the Iran nuclear deal. So a key ingredient in our Iran nuclear deal is that we get to have the higher rank in the fight against ISIL in Iraq. And in effect, what we did was we codified our alliance with Iran, at least in Iraq, even though we're fighting Iran in Yemen. So here's the thought I want you to end with. And then I'm going to open it up to Q&A. Had we not done the Iraq War, there would have been no al-Qaeda in Iraq that then would have morphed into ISIL. Now, who knows how it would have looked when the Arab Spring got to Iraq, but really nasty tyrants have been taken out by the Arab Spring. Having said that, in the case of Bouteflika and Bashar al-Assad, really nasty tyrants have survived. Having said that, nowhere in the Middle East is better off since the Arab Spring. I gotta tell you, I am a revolutionary. I believe that sometimes you just gotta stick it to the man and you gotta do a little bit of violence to straighten out your state. But I'm really losing faith fast because at the end of the day, I'm trying to find examples of when revolutions have actually created better states on the other end. And I'm running out. My list is really, really small. It's almost zero. It really is zero, but I'm holding on to the almost because I want it to not feel that way. And so here's the tragedy, that in a weird way, ISIL is ours. We created ISIL. ISIL exists because of what we did in Iraq. This is our monster. We're Dr. Frankenstein. The refugee problem that exists now that we're not taking any credit for, right? Although I guess we changed our tone today. I heard that we're going to now take 85,000 instead of 10,000. And then they hope to get the number up by 2017 to 100,000. But, 2017 is a long way away. Like, really? Why don't you do 100,000 now? And then we'll talk. And by the way, the 85,000 is next year, not this year. So just for the record, which next year is still a long ways away. Who knows how many of them will still be alive? The crisis exists because of this. So first of all, this is the worst refugee. Stop calling them migrants, by the way. A migrant is, I'm moving from point A to point B because I want a better job. These are not migrants. A refugee is a person who's escaping death and destitution and utter ruin. They're not going because they want a new job. They're going because they're trying to stay alive and keep their family alive. These are refugees. This is not a migrant crisis. This is a refugee crisis. Every time the radio says migrant, I want to punch somebody in the nose. Yeah. Anyway, there's a reason we have two words for this. The the world right now is facing the worst refugee problem since World War II. In the last 70 years, we've never experienced anything like what we're experiencing right now. There are 60 million displaced people in the world right now. It's almost 1% of the world's population. Of that, 4 million are Syrians. So Syrians are about 7% of the world's displaced population. There are 2 million in Syria, and then there are 2 million out of Syria. The majority of the Syrian refugees are in Turkey and in Lebanon. Lebanon is now 1/4 refugee. 1/4 of Lebanon's population is either from Iraq or Syria. They're refugees who have fled. Another 3 or 4 million of the world's refugees are Iraqi refugees. It's probably closer to 4 million. And there's about 2 million displaced refugees in Iraq. It's not 4 million it used to be. It's coming down because a lot of those refugees, 1.4 million of Iraq's 4 million refugees, were in Syria, and they're now turning around and going back to Iraq because they figure, what's the point in being in Syria? I might as well be in misery in my own country if I'm going to be in misery in this country. Here's another fun little stat about that 1.4 million Iraqi refugees that were in Syria, 40% of which were Christian. Iraq's population was 5% Christian. In other words, our war in Iraq caused the Christian population in Iraq to suffer unduly so badly that they actually ended up fleeing in much greater numbers than the Muslim population. So if our goal was to de-Christianize Iraq, well done, pull that off. Having said that, about 8 million of the world's refugees are Palestinian. So between Iraq, Syria, and Palestine, it's 16 million of the 60 million refugees around the world. In other words, those 3 states alone account for, it's almost a third. It is a third when you throw in all the Eritreans and Libyans who are also, and Yemenis who are also escaping conflict. 1/3 of the world's refugees are from the Arab world alone. If the Arab world is probably just over 300 million people. So you realize really fast that this is a really big problem for the Arab world, that it's been completely destabilized in the last 4 years. Now, this crisis at first was focused primarily on Jordan, Lebanon, and Turkey, and Syria, because Syria had so many Iraqi refugees. The amazing thing about Jordan is now, I believe, 20 or 25% native. It is almost entirely now Palestinian refugee, Iraqi refugee, and Syrian refugee. I know there's been a lot of bad press about Saudi Arabia, and they're not taking in the refugees. They're trying to say they have been. I don't really have an opinion on Saudi Arabia. I do know that the UAE has taken in 100,000. The UAE is now down to about 20% of its population being native. It's about 80% foreigner. UAE is a really small state. It's filthy rich beyond your imagination, but it's also an extremely small state. The fact that they took in 100,000 is disproportionate to their population. I think the UAE's population is 2 million. Germany's 84 million. Germany's taking 800,000. UAE took in 100,000, right? UAE is way more generous than Germany. Don't get me wrong. I'm quarter German. I'm really proud that the Germans are doing this. I think it's fantastic. Am I a quarter? I'm an eighth German. I always get that messed up. All right, this is wonderful. It's amazing. But then there's the other side of it. Germany, Sweden, Italy, and Greece have taken the brunt of the refugee problem. Greece is in economic ruin. Italy's teetering always. Italy can't really afford this. At one point, Italy had ships in the Mediterranean that they were paying for, trying to rescue refugees out of the kindness of their heart. There was nobody ordering them to do this, and they basically got sick of doing it by themselves. They kept begging for help. They kept asking the French for help. They kept asking other European states for help. And finally, they just said, oh, we're not going to do it alone, and they quit, which was kind of sad. I wish they had held out, because I'm also an eighth Italian. Having said that, then there are the jerk states, like the United Kingdom, the United States, and Hungary, the states that won't do their share in this crisis. Now, if we do up to 85,000 and we do it this year instead of next year, then I won't think we're as big a jerks. We're still jerks, Because think about it. We have a GDP 4.5 times the size of Germany's. We have a population 4 times the size of Germany. We have a state that's 22 times the size of Germany in land, and we were talking about 10,000. Now we're talking about 85,000. They're going to take 800,000. They're going to take 10 times that. It'll be 1% of Germany's population, right? Just to give you an idea how well we've done in the past, there is a single town in Sweden. Sweden's per capita probably the most generous country on earth. They not only give 1% of their GDP as foreign aid, we do 0.1%. They do literally 10 times as much per person. Not only do they do that, but they also take in 100% of the Syrian refugees who arrive in Sweden are accepted, and they are given work permits and free education, and they are given free assistance to get on their feet. So they're given apartments if they can't afford them. Sweden's a tiny country. It's not as tiny as it used to be. I think it's up to almost 500,000 refugees. It's only 10 million people in population. So this is a massive chunk of their population. There's one town in Sweden of 60,000 people that is now half Syrian and Iraqi refugee. The vast majority are Iraqi refugee. It's like 30,000 Iraqi refugees, 5,000 Syrian refugees, 30,000 Swedes. The United States and Great Britain have taken less than 30,000 Iraqi refugees. In other words, there's one town in Sweden that has more Iraqi refugees than the United States and Great Britain combined. So the disaster that we inflicted on the world with the Iraq War, and then the subsequent blowover that's gone into Syria, we've left the brunt of the damage to be handled by Europe and the Middle East. Poor countries like Jordan have to take care of the Syrian crisis pretty much on their own. They get some UN assistance, but they're stuck with the brunt of the cost. Right? Turkey has a strong economy. There's only so much they can do. By the way, if you want to see something really weird, go Google Earth or Google Maps and zoom in, do satellite, and zoom in on the Turkish-Syrian border. Turkey has created this massive swath between Turkey and Syria. And you can tell it was recent because you can see that there are still old farms in it, and it's just a no man's land. They've made a massive buffer so that they can prevent ISIL from crossing the border, which is good because they used to let ISIL freely cross the border. By the way, Turkey has been ISIL's #1 trading partner. Turkey was buying ISIL oil for the longest time. And they're our ally. Like, can you imagine what it would have been like if they had been our enemy? Anyway, I want questions, and I know I'm running out of time, so I'm going to stop here, and I'm going to open it up to questions. Okay, so the question was that states like Germany, European states that are taking in all these refugees, so the generous states, are doing it because they have negative population growth, and that this is their way of compensating, whereas we have our own refugee crisis, right? The 11 million people that Donald Trump wants to deport. So to put, Ryan, what's at stake here? Technically, I think most of those are migrants, but we won't get into the technicality there. I'm sure there are a lot of refugees amongst them. There's no doubt that states like Germany have declining populations. By the way, Denmark, which has recently been really nasty towards the migrants, also has declining population. They could definitely use an increased level of population. They're not getting it. I am sure that the Germans sat down and made this calculation. In the case of Sweden, they're taking such a huge population on, I don't think you can make that argument. Sweden has a negative population growth, but they're taking way more than they need to compensate for that. In the case of Germany, you could make that argument because they are hemorrhaging a lot of people per year, but taking 800,000 refugees instantaneously in a country that's 84 million people, basically adding 1% instantly to your population, that's such a huge economic burden. There's got to be a cheaper way to get your free labor or your cheap labor. Like if that was really Germany's goal, I think they could have done it in a much more efficient, much easier to absorb manner. And historically they have. There's a huge Turkish population. I think the Turks are close to 4 million now in Germany. And that's what they've done to compensate for their labor problem because they do have a negative population growth. If I were Germany, I would want Syrians because Syrians tend to be really well educated. They tend to have a lot of technical skills. But then why don't we take them? Because isn't that what we need in the United States too? So I don't know. And one of the things I keep hearing pop up is Sweden's very racist. That's true. Name a country on earth that isn't racist, right? South Africa has had protests that are black South Africans protesting because they're angry at the blacks coming from other states in Africa looking for work. And you're like, oh my God, like that's so weird. And the reason that that's possible is because that's our nature, right? We form cliques, we formed our little group, and we don't want anybody messing with our clique. We are all a little xenophobic. What I'm interested in is not what's in your heart anymore. I'm interested in what are your actions. And if you, I don't care what your motivation is almost. I guess if Germans were planning on eating the Syrians, maybe that would change my framework. But if you're going to be generous, who cares what's in your heart at that point? You're actually doing something about this crisis. I'll tell you this, I think that the German government was shamed into doing it. I think the German government was initially really, really slow to do anything, and a couple of things happened. One was that Palestinian refugee. Do you guys remember this? Angela Merkel is doing like one of these town hall meetings where she's going around talking, and this Palestinian girl stands up. She's like, I think she was 13 or 14, and she goes, I speak German, I have a good education, I'm a good person, I plan to do hard work. Why am I and my family, why are we being deported? There's nowhere for us to go. Our country was taken over by a bunch of Americans and Europeans, and she starts crying, the girl starts crying, and Angela Merkel goes, it's okay. You're going to be fine. We're going to deport you. Everything's, and it was a disaster on film. It was an utter disaster. And a bunch of Germans went, wow, we don't want to be that country. And Angela Merkel reversed everything and offered the girl instant asylum and like a few days later, because she saw how her words and her patting the girl looked like a robot. You know what I mean? And she changed her opinion. And then the other thing that happened was when Syrians would arrive at the train stations, when Syrians would arrive at train stations, they would find shoes and clothing waiting for them. The German people were actually going to the train stations and leaving stuff. And the German government went, oh my God, we're behind our own people on this. We got to get ahead of them. How can we do that? And then they said, let's take 800,000. In the case of Hungary, which has been barbed wire crazy, tear gas canisters, right? Hungary really needs to think about a swastika in the middle of their flag. The Hungarian people have kind of made up for their government too. They were doing the same thing. They began dropping food and clothing off for the Syrian refugees. So I think it's sort of a mixed bag on what people are expecting and what's happening. And it is complicated and messy. And I have no doubt that population is part of the equation. Any other questions? Isn't the PKK a terrorist organization? And that's why Turkey is justified in bombing the PKK. How do you get on the terrorist list and how are you not? If you define terrorism as you are intentionally targeting a civilian population, right? Then how was the US war in Iraq not an act of terrorism? How was the US bombing campaign over Japan and Germany in World War II not an act of terrorism? If you define war as I'm intentionally targeting military, and then terrorism is intentionally targeting civilians, then at that point, I don't know, like, how did we arbitrarily decide we're not terrorists, but they are? It's a little weird. In the case of Turkey, in the case of the Kurds, they've been fighting the Turks for good reason for a long time. Their language was banned in Turkey. It's not anymore. They actually have their own radio stations now. It's really weird. The Turks so denied the existence of Kurds that on paper, Kurds were officially classified as mountain Turks. Like mountain Turk? What, you mean like mountain lion? Mountain goat? Like, what the hell is that, a mountain Turk? So weird. Sometimes people do the coolest things. I want to be a mountain, what would I be, a mountain Texan? There's no mountains in Texas. Yes, there are. They're not big, but there are. I've seen them. I've even been in one. Anyway, so I don't know. I mean, at the end of the day, when I look at the PKK, I see a really solid military capable institution that is capable of fighting ISIL. And then why aren't the Kurds being allowed to have their own state? I mean, right, isn't this the aspiration of self-determination? And the answer is the Turks don't want to give up their chunk of Kurdistan. They want to hold on to it, and they're willing to do anything they can to keep it. They don't care about the Kurds at all. They would just assume, be quite cruel to them. There was a prime minister? Yeah, prime minister. No, she was a member of parliament, sorry. She was just a member of parliament. Who, I want to say it was like 25 years ago, in parliament, in Turkish parliament, got up and spoke Kurdish and went to jail. And I think they put her in jail for like 17 years or something psychotic like that. Why? Because she uttered Kurdish words, like it's a crime. So you can kind of see why if you were a Kurd, you'd be militarized and ready to inflict violence. And the Peshmerga has been much better about not attacking the Turks. I think that's the real difference between the PKK and the Peshmerga, is the Peshmerga doesn't fight the Turks, the PKK does. I don't think otherwise, militarily, there's much difference between the two. Ideologically, there is. The PKK is very secular and socialist, and the Peshmerga has a little bit more religion involved. Okay, so the question is, what will be the long-term consequences, repercussions of this mass Arab migration to Europe? I mean, first of all, it's a disaster for the local states, right? If Syria loses 4 million people, I think its population is 26 million, you can see really quickly that that's not something you ever want to do. Especially because you got to figure, as a general rule, the people who are fleeing have enough money to flee, so they're probably at least middle class. And that probably also suggests that they're highly educated, or at least better educated than the average Syrian. So it's not like Syria is hemorrhaging, a bunch of really poor, uneducated people. So that's something that Syria doesn't want to have happen up front anyway. And the same is true for Iraq. It is such a large population, you have to assume that a huge chunk of it won't go home ever, right? Sometimes when people move, they think they're going home and they just never do. How many people come to the United States for school, hell-bent on going home and taking their knowledge with them back with the hope of making their country better, and then life happens, and you end up staying in the United States anyway, which is kind of what our trick is, right? Because if we didn't get all those people coming over and getting an education, we wouldn't have enough MDs, and we wouldn't have enough computer scientists, and we wouldn't have enough engineers. So at some point, that's kind of our trick to get people to come here and stay, is that you'll be here 4 years or 6 years or whatever, and then life will happen. So that's certain. There will always now be a large Syrian and a large Iraqi presence in Europe. That's irreversible. I would think that the average Iraqi and the average Syrian would want to go home afterwards. But that's one of the problems that everybody's grappling with, because there's already a significant Egyptian population in Hungary, for example. There's already a significant Turkish population in Germany. So one of the questions that Hungary and Germany are asking is, do we really want to add to this large and growing Muslim population, or do we want to preserve, this is the Hungarian terminology, preserve the Christian nature of Europe, which is weird in part because a lot of the Syrian refugees are Christian, but there you go, that's racism for you. There's very little research involved in racism. At the end of the day, I think that's what Germany's really asking itself, and what Hungary's really asking itself, and Great Britain's really asking itself. And Great Britain and Denmark and Hungary are coming down on the wrong side of history, because I think the majority will go home. Who wants to leave their home? If we had a crisis in Texas and you were forced out of your home, most of you are going to want to go back. Even if you say, but there are better jobs in Germany. Yeah, but everybody loves their home. You know what I mean? At the end of the day, nobody really wants to leave their home. It's painful. You have to learn a new culture. You have to assimilate new languages. There are things about the foreigners that you're going to hate, right? Germans are not known for being particularly warm people. I lived in Germany for 5 years. I'm here to tell you that we're not very warm people. Whereas on the other hand, Syrians are. And that's going to be a weird cultural thing for Syrians. It's been something that Syrians and Iraqis have been talking about in Sweden, that they're into hugging and they're into smiling and telling jokes to complete strangers, and Swedes are like, So Yeah, I don't know. One more question? So the question is, how long will the ISIL conflict last? And if it lasts a long time, it lasts a generation, then obviously those refugees are going to be there for a long time. Sweden's attitude is that the refugees are never leaving. They've just decided that that's going to be their default setting. Now, if they leave, that's fine. If they don't leave, that's fine too, because they're just assuming that. So what the Swedes are doing is they're taking the kids and they're teaching them Swedish and they're putting them through the Swedish education system because they're just assuming that those kids are going to be there and they don't want them separated and alienated and turn into a minority that's, impoverished and ghettoized, because they know that long term that's going to be catastrophic. What they want is they want a bunch of dark Syrian descent Swedes. That's their goal. Germany's asylum policy isn't as cool as Sweden's asylum policy, so they might have a little bit more separation than the Swedes are hoping to achieve. So that is an issue. I can't tell you how long the ISIL conflict is going to last, because I've discovered as I get older that if you can imagine the worst possible thing to happen, it's probably going to happen. And so you just need to assume that this is only going to get worse. It's probably not going to get better. If we put boots on the ground, which I keep hearing people say, it's not going to make the situation any better. That's how we got the situation to begin with. But if we don't put boots on the ground, ISIL isn't going away anytime soon. So we're caught in a catch-22. We can't, there's no winning this. The only thing you could do at this point is sort of mitigate the damage. But since it's damage we caused, it's really hard to imagine how we get out of this. I don't know. I don't know how. The only way I see the ISIL being put down is Middle East states put boots on the ground and go do it. And I just don't see Saudi Arabia, Iran, and Turkey going into Iraq and Syria and cleaning the place up. I can't, not only can I not imagine it because I don't think that the Saudis have the skill. I think the Iranians and the Turks do. But I don't think they have the willpower to work together. I think they just don't like each other enough to do it. And at the end of the day, I don't think they have the wealth. I mean, Saudi Arabia does, but Turkey and Iran, it would be a serious drain on their economies. So I just don't see anybody who has the willpower to fix the situation. If what we've done over the course of the bombing campaign that map illustrates over the last year, if we continue at that pace, we've driven ISIL out of 1% of the territory that it had when we started it a little bit over a year ago. So I think that's 99 more years. That's my prediction, that ISIL will be defeated in 2114. I mean, this is how bad this is. Of course, if it did last that long, right, ISIL would have to tone down. If for no other reason, just because you can't rule your population indefinitely on terror. You can do it for a long time, but obviously 100 years is too long. At some point, ISIL is going to have to try and mainstream. I mean, this is how we're going to end the conflict in Afghanistan. We've been in negotiations for like 6 years now with the Taliban, but the goal is to create a hybrid government with the Taliban on board. Right? And the Taliban are saying that they're going to tone down and everything's going to be okay because they're going to mainstream. And it's how the Irish conflict more or less ended, right? Was the Sinn Féin said, they were going to give up the armed conflict and they were going to become a mainstream political party. So, I'm being optimistic, but maybe that's the future for ISIL. If it's not, and the Middle East continues to dissolve and more states fall, right? They've got half of Iraq and almost half of Syria. They're threatening to invade Jordan down the road. If more states keep falling, then this looks like a scenario where ISIL's in Libya now, ISIL's in Egypt now, ISIL's in Yemen now. This starts to look a little bit like an Armageddon scenario where the whole Middle East gets sucked up by ISIL. And you think we have a refugee problem now, it'll be a complete disaster. And it'll also be horrible for the amount of history that we'll lose in the end. You can just see what ISIL just did to Palmyra. It's freaking heartbreaking. And I think I want to address that Palmyra thing. I know I'm over, but I just want to say one thing about that real quick. I mean, I keep hearing the news say this is a Roman ruin, oh, it's so sad. It is a Roman ruin, and this is very sad. But you have to remember the Romans were in Syria for almost 700 years. That the Syrians don't see Palmyra as oh, look, a foreigner ruin in our country. They see that as just as much theirs as the Italians see the Colosseum in Rome as theirs. So for Syria, the loss of Palmyra isn't the loss of a Roman ruin, it's the loss of a Syrian ruin. Now, much of Palmyra is still intact. They just blew up two buildings last time I checked, the temple and another building. But they destroyed Nimrud. They just bulldozed it. And they've plundered the Mosul Museum. And apparently what they're doing is anything small enough they're selling. So they're helping actually fund their war by selling the small stuff. The big stuff they blow up and the small stuff they sell. I wouldn't be surprised if they're taking pieces of Palmyra and selling those as well. It makes you want to break the hands of the people buying the stuff, except that by buying it, then that stuff gets saved. So what do, right? Except invade Iraq again? I don't know. All right, anyway, we're out of time. We're over. Sorry for taking over.